Hey guys, so I've received a number of questions about how to use PioSolver, so I decided to make this step-by-step basic tutorial, which is designed to be very easy to digest even for a relatively new poker player. So if you're already proficient with Pio, feel free to skip this video, but if you're thinking about getting the solver, or perhaps you already have it but aren't quite fluid with it yet, this video is for you. So this discussion will be broken up into 4 parts. Part 1 is an overview of PioSolver. In Part 2, I will talk about the inputs, which are the relevant characteristics of the hand we are analyzing that we plug into the solver. In Part 3, I will talk about the outputs, which show the GTO strategies that Pio solves for based on our inputs. And finally, in the 4th part, I'll go over some study tips. So Part 1 overview. What is PioSolver? Generally, PioSolver is a piece of software that calculates optimal playing strategies by running simulations of a given hand. So what does that mean as a practical matter? In essence, Pio solves for strategies at each spot of a hand that are perfectly balanced and unexploitable given set assumptions. In other words, if you played millions and millions of hands against a villain with a known range and strategies, and you strictly followed Pio's advice, but the villain deviated from Pio's advice, in the long run you will win money and the villain will lose money. And a quick note on the recommended computer requirements to run Pio comfortably. You will want 64-bit Windows, a quad-core processor, which affects the speed of the solver, and 16 gigabytes of RAM, which affects how many variables you can input. You can also run the program with a dual-core processor and 8 gigabytes of RAM, but I personally would recommend 32 gigabytes of RAM since some complicated trees require more memory. So we talked about what PioSolver is. Let's talk about what PioSolver is not. PioSolver does not solve multi-way. It will only compute strategies for 2 opponents, since adding other opponents would make the decision trees too complex for standard computers to solve. However, this doesn't mean that PioSolver is useless for multi-way situations, because you can still use it to learn strategic concepts that can be applied in multi-way spots with some modifications. PioSolver, in my opinion, is not just for experts or high-stakes players, although many believe this to be the case. PioSolver solves for fundamentally sound poker strategies, which, in my opinion, should be the starting point of how you learn to play. Yes, at lower stakes, players are very unbalanced, meaning they are open to being exploited. But 1, it's hard to recognize imbalances and know how to make the proper exploits without knowing what the baseline strategy is, and 2, once you deviate from GTO to try to exploit others, you become exploitable yourself. And finally, you often hear that GTO players are like robots. In my opinion, this could not be further from the truth. First of all, no one can memorize every single strategy produced by the solver for every single situation. There's just too many variables. Secondly, we mentioned that Pio solves for optimal solutions given set assumptions. However, in reality, you won't know your opponent's exact ranges or strategies, so a true perfect solution against real-life opponents isn't available. So what is Pio good for then as a practical matter? Well, we often hear that poker is a game of incomplete information. PioSolver is a tool that we can use to mine for the information that is most important in a given spot, and also learn how to apply that information to formulate the optimal strategies. I also want to note that there are a number of features of PioSolver that I will not be discussing in this video, including preflop, limit hold'em, and some more advanced features which I may cover in a subsequent video, but this video should give you all the information you need to get started. Part 2 Inputs. The inputs are the variables from our hand that we insert into Pio to solve for, including the hand ranges, the flop, the starting pot, the effective stack size, and the betting parameters. When you first open up Pio, this is the screen you'll see, but to get started, you should click on this tab, Post-Flop Tree Building and Calculations. Now, this may seem like a lot, but we are going to use a hand example to show, step by step, how to complete these inputs. So here we have a 1-2 no-limit game. It folds around to the button with Ace-King of spades, and he bets 3x the big blind. The small blind folds and the big blind calls with 10 jack of diamonds, and the flop comes queen jack 10. So in order for Pio to solve for the optimal strategies for this hand, the first thing we're going to do is input the assumed ranges for both players. So to set up the out of position player's range, we will click here and this pop-up will appear, which shows a standard hand matrix with the pocket pairs down the middle diagonally, the unsuited combos on the left-hand side, and the suited combos on the right-hand side. To add a holding, we simply click the applicable combo we want to add, and to remove it, we just click again. You can also assign a weight or frequency to the holdings. So for example, here the out of position player who acts first post flop is the big blind. And let's say we think the big blind will call with 7-6 offsuit 25% of the time and fold 75% of the time. Since the big blind called in our scenario, here we're creating the big blind's calling range. So we are going to set the weight at 25% and then click the 7-6 offsuit box. And you would continue to do this for the entire calling range. However, as you can probably imagine, this can become quite tedious. So on the right hand here, you'll see saved preflop ranges, including some that are provided by Pio out of the box. So if we click on this preset range of big blind against button, it will populate the entire range instantly. You can also save your own ranges for future use by clicking this button, naming the range, and then hit save, and now this range will be saved for future use. So once we are satisfied with the range, we click OK, and then we do the same drill for the in position player, which is the button in our case. So we're going to use the preset button opening range here. Also, if we want to, we can tweak the saved range. Say we think the button should open all Jack X suited combos, we can simply add them and then click OK. So the next input is the board, which is simply the cards on the flop. So in our example, it was Queen of Spades, Jack of Spades, 10 of Clubs. So we're going to click on Select and then select the cards in our flop, and then we click OK. The starting pot is the number of chips in the pot after pre-flop betting has ended, but before post-flop betting has begun. So in our case, $13. So I'm going to put that here. The effective stack is the stack of the player with the least amount of chips, since that is the maximum amount that can be won or lost in the hand. In our case, it's the button with $94, so we're going to input that here. So in this area, we will set the betting parameters for each player on the flop, turn, and river. Obviously, in real life, there are countless different bets that a player can make, but in order for the solver to work on a standard PC, we need to limit our betting options to specific choices. As a rule of thumb, you generally want to include as many options as possible so the results will be more realistic. For example, if you don't give one player the option to check raise, then you'll see Pio causing the other player to be more aggressive since he doesn't have to worry about being raised. That being said, you can't include too many options or it'll take up too much of your computer's memory to solve. Usually I try to include a small, medium, and large bet on each street and some overbets on the river and sometimes on the turn, and at least one raise option on each street as well. So first we're going to set up the betting parameters for the in position player, which is the button. The bets are expressed as a percentage of the pot, and you can enter multiple betting options just by placing a space between the bets. So I'm going to give the button the option to bet 25%, 50%, and 100% on each street. And I'm also going to add a 200% pot overbet on the river. And here we will input the raise options for the players. You can also express this as a percentage of the pot, or you can express it as a multiple of the opponent's bet, which I think is more typical in real life. So I'm going to go ahead and add a 3x raise for each street. And you can also add multiple raises here as well. You can also check this box if you want to include an all-in option on any street, which will be triggered if the thresholds indicated here are met. And if you want to use the same betting parameters for both positions, we can simply click this button and it will clone the settings for the out-of-position player. Also for the out-of-position player, you can add donk bets, which will give the out-of-position player the option to lead out with a bet after it called a bet on the prior street. And again, this is expressed as a percentage of the pot, so I'm going to add a 50% donk bet on the turn and on the river. So the last variable we're going to discuss on this tab is the accuracy, which basically sets how long you want the sim to run. The longer the sim runs, the closer and closer it gets to the equilibrium strategy, which is achieved at an accuracy of 0. As a general rule of thumb, you want to set this at no greater than 0.5. Personally, I usually set this at 0.1 or 0.05, but if you want more accuracy than that, Pio will usually take a very long time to complete the solve depending on how complex the tree is. So I'm going to go ahead and check this box and then input 0.5 here for our example. So now that we have our inputs in place, we're going to click this button, which causes Pio to create the decision tree based on our inputs. And here where it says OK, that means the decision tree has been built, and we can press Go, which triggers Pio to begin solving. So this line at the bottom will tell you the progress of the solver, and after it reaches the accuracy you designated, in our case 0.5%, the solver will stop the sim, as noted here. And now we are ready to view the outputs. In part 3, we are going to discuss the outputs Pio produces after solving the game based upon our inputs. The 4 main topics will be navigating the decision tree, the range and combo matrices, the Hotness Chart, and the Range Explorer. So we can view the solver's outputs by clicking back on this browser tab. And there are 3 main focal points in this layout. Decision tree, which is comprised of the different actions each player can take on the flop, turn, and river. The range matrix, which shows information for a player's entire range at each point in the tree. And the combo matrix, which shows information for specific holdings in each player's range at each point in the tree. So first we're going to look at the decision tree in isolation and not worry about the other aspects of this layout for now. So the full tree is hidden at the moment, and to uncover different branches of the tree, you click on these buttons, which correspond to the betting inputs we added on the previous tab, which I have a screenshot of here. So this line tells us whose turn it is to act, and obviously the out of position player, the big blind, will be acting first. So he has 3 options based on the betting strategies we designated: 25% pot, 50% pot, and 100% pot. Also, checking will be an option on each street as well for the out of position player. So going back to our example, the big blind checks, so we are going to check, and now we see it's the in position player's turn, which is the button. So we see here that the button bets half pot, so we're going to press this button, and the action is back on the out of position player. But now, since there has been a bet placed, the big blind's options will be to fold, call, or raise 3x based on the option we provided in the input tab. However, in our example, the big blind just calls, so we're going to call and move to the turn. And now Pio is asking us to choose a turn card. The turn is the King of Hearts, so we're going to click this, and now it's the big blind's turn to act again. The big blind checks, and the button bets half pot, and the big blind calls. And now we're at the river, which is the 10 of spades, and the big blind checks. The button bets half pot. The big blind raises 3x, the button's bet, and the button calls. I should also note that you can go back and forth at any point in the tree to change a card or an action, which will then lead you down a different decision branch. So now we're going to look at the range and combo matrices, which will give us information about the optimal strategies and strengths of the holdings in each player's range at each point in the decision tree. So first we're going to go all the way back to the flop to the button's decision. And to see the solve strategy for the button, we click here. And now we see the GTO strategies for each of the button's holdings on the flop. These strategies are color-coded based on the 4 options we have given the button on the flop. So checking is green, light red is a quarter pot bet, medium red is a half pot bet, and dark red is a full pot bet. And this also shows the overall percentages Pio is utilizing these strategies for its entire range. So we see that Pio is advising that 29% of the button's range should check on this board, 15% should bet a quarter pot, and so on. And to see the optimal strategy for each holding, we can go into the range matrix with our cursor, And we will then see in the combo matrix the specific strategy for each particular holding. So for example, if we hover our cursor over the ace-king suited holdings, we see in the combo matrix that the predominant strategy here is to bet half pot 56% of the time. And if we click through the decision tree, we can see how the strategies change at each spot. So in addition to strategy, we can also view our range as equity. As you know, the equity of a hand is the odds of that hand winning at showdown, assuming we went all in at this point with no further betting or action. So over here are buttons we can click on to see the equity of the out of position and the in position player at this point in the decision tree. So here we see that the equities of the various holdings are color-coded to this spectrum, with the holdings most likely to win being green and the holdings least likely to win being red. And we can explore the range matrix to see the equities of individual holdings. We see here that ace-king of spades has a 95% chance to win based on this board against the big blind's overall range. This is obviously going to be high because the button has the nut straight with the redraw to the nut flush, but it's not 100% because the big blind has holdings in its range that may hit a full house or a straight flush on later streets. Also note that you can see the average equity of the entire range here. In addition to equity, the solver can also show us another metric of hand strength, EV, or expected value, which tells us how many chips on average a holding will win if the optimal strategy is followed. This, in my opinion, is a more accurate measure of hand strength than equity because it takes into account subsequent betting. So to look at the EV, we click on this button for the out of position player and this button for the in position player. Again, the EVs are color-coded based on this spectrum here, and we can see for ace-king of spades that we should expect to win around 32 chips with this holding on average when the hand is completed. Also, you can see the average EV for the entire range here. One of the most useful features on this tab is being able to see the optimal strategy plus the EV simultaneously, and you can see this by pressing this button. So now when we explore the range matrix, we see in the combo matrix the EV of each of the possible strategies, which is useful to tell us which option in the decision tree will make us the most money on average. So for example, with ace-king of spades, we see that the strategy which will win us the most chips on average is betting half pot with 31.665 chips, but each option is pretty close, which means Pio is mostly indifferent between the strategies. And if you want to see the strategies, EV, and equities for the range at the same time, you can click Clone Zoom and a pop-up will appear that will be fixed on the current view setting, in this case EV plus strategy. And if we change the setting for the entire range to equity, the zoomed matrix is still on EV plus strategy, so you can explore each holding to see the EV and strategy up top and equity on the bottom simultaneously. Another way we can visually analyze EV is by comparing the difference in EVs between two different strategies by clicking this button. For example, if we go to the button's action on the turn and want to see the difference in EV between checking and betting half pot, we can check these boxes and click OK. So again, the matrices will be color-coded to this spectrum. White means the difference in EV between betting half pot and checking is 0. And the darker the color, the more pronounced the difference in EV will be between the two actions. So for example, we see that it is more plus EV to bet these sets and straights with a redraw to the nut flush, while it is more plus EV to check these one pair and two pair combos. This function can be particularly useful for when you want to simplify your strategy to use a pure 100% or 0% rule. So for example, if you want to find boards you can c-bet your entire range with and not have to worry about all the mixed frequencies, you can use this function. And if the matrix is mostly white, that means you won't be losing too much EV from choosing either strategy, putting aside frequency and balance concerns in the long run. So the next feature I want to highlight are the filters. There are two types of filters on this screen, a betting filter and a suit filter. The betting filter allows you to isolate in the range matrix the holdings which are taking a specific action in the decision tree. So for example, if I want to analyze only hands that check on this flop in the button's shoes, I can simply click this here, and the matrices will now show me what percentage of the time these holdings are checking. So we can see ace king of spades is checking on this board on the turn 0.3% of the time. And we can apply the same filter for our other betting options. There's also a suit filter here. This allows us to filter to see only holdings with a particular suit by left clicking. Clicking the top button will show the holdings that have this suit with the higher ranked card, and clicking the bottom button will show us the holdings that have this suit with the lower ranked card. So you can see holdings that have either the higher ranked card or the lower ranked card with this suit by clicking both. This filter obviously will be useful if you want to isolate and examine how flushes or flush draws should be played. You can also filter by the holdings that exclude a particular suit by right-clicking the suit. So this is now showing me all holdings that do not contain a spade. You can also filter both the betting action and the suit simultaneously. So for example, if I want to see all holdings that contain a spade that bet half pot, I can click here, here, and here, and now both filters are applied. Another feature I want to highlight is the Hotness Chart, which shows how turn and river cards affect the EVs, equities, and strategies of each player, which can be very useful to help understand how different cards alter range advantage or disadvantage. You can pull up the Hotness Chart by going to Analysis and clicking here, or alternatively, you can just press Ctrl H, but first you have to be on the turn or river card node. So I'm going to go to the turn card node and then press Ctrl H. So in the columns are all the card ranks, and in the rows are all the suits. So this grid contains all cards possible in the game. And if we want to see how different turn cards affect the out of position player's equity, we can click this button, and we see that the best cards for the big blind are 9 through queen. Pretty much anything that brings in a lower straight or pairs the board, and the worst card is the king because the button will have a lot of ace high that makes a straight. And we can do the same thing with EV, and we see that any king or pretty much any brick is bad for the big blind's range. And if we click here, it will tell us how the different cards affect the big blind strategy. And as we can see here, Pio is checking most of its range no matter what card comes out because this board just massively favors the button. But Pio will do some infrequent donking with 9s, 10s, jacks, queens, and aces. And if you click on a card here, it will automatically update in the main browser. And just a quick note, I'm not going to get into the details in terms of what these boxes do, other than to say that they should generally all be checked most of the time. Except this box, you may want to uncheck it on later streets if the range matrix becomes difficult to read. So what this box does is it gives you a visual representation of the proportion of combos the range should have at any given point in the tree. So for example, on the river, we can barely see what the strategy is for queen jack off, since based on the prior action, Pio is saying that the button should have very few combos of queen jack in its range. But this is very hard to see, so to get a better look, we can uncheck this box and it'll fill out all the holdings, including ones that have folded. So the last feature I'm going to show is the Range Explorer, which can be accessed by clicking this button. So the Range Explorer has many of the same functions as the general browser, which I'm not going to get into again, such as the equity, betting filter, and suit filter. Just a quick note, there are 2 additional ways to examine hand strength in the Range Explorer. The first is EV Rescaled, which basically restates the EV assuming a 100 chip pot, which makes it easier to compare to equity. The second is EV divided by EQ, or equity realization, which will generally give you a sense of the playability of a holding. But the main feature I want to focus on in the Range Explorer is the segment filter, which is personally the feature I spend most of my time studying. So if you want to filter everything out and look at a particular segment, all you have to do is click on the segment row, and only information for that particular segment will show up in the range matrix. So these are the straights, sets, 2-pair, etc. I would be careful where you click because these rows actually contain a spectrum of hand strength. So for example, if you want to see which gut shots have the best equity, you can start clicking right to left, which will then start omitting the gut shots with lower equity until we get to ace queen and ace ace, which have a lot of equity. You can also filter multiple segments at the same time by using these buttons here, where any basically means or and all basically means and. So for example, if we only want to examine single paired holdings, we first select none, which unchecks all the segments. Then we select any and click on the over pairs, top pairs, second pairs, third pairs, and lower pairs. And this now shows only the holdings that contain one pair. Alternatively, if we want to show holdings that contain both bottom pair and a flush draw, we click all and then the third pair and flush draw segments. And now this shows only hands that contain both a 10 and 2 spades. And now the final part, study tips. The first tip is to review the entire range, including its segments and holdings, for both the hero and the villain on each street. I think some people may use PO to analyze a particular hand they played, which gave them trouble, and once they identify the optimal strategy for their specific hand, that's the end of their study. In my opinion, this is myopic for at least 2 reasons. One, the solver generally does not create solutions in a vacuum, so a holding that is played a certain way in one spot may be played in a completely different manner in another spot based on the context. Secondly, it's not possible to memorize how the solver is playing each holding in every possible context. And this is why I believe it's important to try to simplify the game as much as possible through generalizations and abstractions, while at the same time retaining as much EV as possible from the equilibrium solutions. The way I personally try to do this is by reviewing and analyzing hands at 3 levels. The first level is the macro analysis, which primarily focuses on overall ranges and how they interact with the board, and also to a lesser extent position and SPR. The macro analysis will inform your overall betting and calling frequencies and bet sizings. The second level of analysis is examining what each segment of the range is doing, which is important because certain segments have characteristics that cause PO to play them in unique ways. And the final stage of the analysis is analyzing individual holdings within segments. However, our goal here is not to memorize how each holding is being played. Instead, we are trying to uncover the underlying factors that are driving the different strategies within the segment, such as blockers, unblockers, showdown equity, and draw equity, which we can then apply across segments in different spots. And the way I use these levels in practice is I always start with the most general level first, the macro strategy, and I will only work my way down to the more specific levels if doing so will win me significant EV. If this seems a bit abstract, I will give an example of how I analyze hands this way in my next tip, which is to take copious notes. As you can see, PioSOLVER provides a huge amount of information, but unless that information is organized and recorded, it will lose a lot of its value. In my opinion, the main way we learn from the solver is by detecting patterns, which is much easier to do if you have a log of sims you've run that you can compare. So here's an example of notes I took for a 100 big blind cash game sim. I'm not going to get too far into the details because I believe that a critical part of the learning process is figuring out the best way to organize the information for your own consumption. I personally went through 5 or 6 different iterations of how I take notes, and that process in and of itself, actively trying to figure out how the solver is structuring its strategies and which data points are most important, was extremely valuable. So keeping that in mind, this area is where I record the macro analysis, and it includes the position of the players, the SPR, the fact that it was a 3-bet pot. This area covers the percentage of nuttish holdings which each player holds, which I use as a rough estimate of range advantage. And this area shows the percentages PO is betting, raising, calling, or checking on the flop with the bet sizings. So here we can see that PO is advising the small blind to bet nearly its entire range, which makes sense since we can see from the Range Explorer that the small blind has an advantage in percentage of nutted hands, and the board is relatively dry, so his nut advantage should remain largely intact. As a result, you can see I indicated ER in this area, which covers flop strategies, which means the small blind is betting its entire range 1/3 pot. And to simplify the game, I'll stop my flop analysis for the small blind here, since I won't get much additional EV by digging into the meso or micro analysis of specific segments or holdings. But if we go to the river, we see that the small blind strategy starts to become mixed. And this is where I use the Range Explorer to examine what each segment of the range is doing. So for example, we see here that these middle pairs with a queen are almost all being checked, which makes sense since they are marginal hands on this board and just want to get to showdown without bloating the pot. So I record that information here, and again, to simplify the game, I stop my analysis for this segment at the meso level without getting into the micro-analysis of what each holding within the segment is doing. However, there are other segments where a micro-analysis is necessary to save EV. For example, if we look at these full houses, we see that there's a significant difference in EV between different strategies, right? We see that these full houses with pocket aces and pocket queens are mostly being checked. I'm guessing because they heavily block many of the value hands the button could call a bet with, so I think the solver is checking with the hopes of inducing a bluff. And I have a page of notes not shown here where I record these types of factors that I think are driving the solver's mixed strategies at the microanalysis level. So my third and final study tip is to ask why, create a hypothesis, and test that hypothesis. PioSolver is a very powerful tool, but at the end of the day, it's just a tool. If you passively go through a sim just to see what the solver is doing and then call it a day, you won't get much out of it. So anytime you encounter a spot where the solver is doing something you don't expect, especially when there's a significant EV difference in strategies, you should ask yourself, why is the solver taking this line? And then you should try to answer. At first, this will be very difficult to do since the solver spits out so much information and it'll be hard to distinguish what is important when you're just getting started. But if you stick with it and run sim after sim and take good notes, eventually you'll start to detect patterns. And from these patterns, you'll start to hypothesize rules or factors which you can then test and prove. And those proved rules or factors are the gold that you can then take with you and apply at the table. And if you want to see how I apply this tip in action, watch my other videos where I'm constantly going through this process and running various tests and experiments. So this is the conclusion of the tutorial video. I hope this was helpful to you because in my opinion, PioSolver is far and away the best bang for your buck to learn the theoretical underpinnings of the game out of any book, podcast, video, training site, or even coach. You just need to know how to use it and diligently put it to work. So if anyone has any questions or wants to learn more, I would encourage you to check out the FAQ section on the PioSolver website or the PioSolver thread on 2+2. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay balanced.